Just to kick this session off, I have a PowerPoint here which talks about the current version of the ConOps, which you can download. But I should put that into perspective. We are aiming to produce a new version of the ConOps at the beginning of next year. So I invite you, listening to the presentations today and what I'm about to say in the 20 minutes before lunch, to think about what you would like and contact me with your inputs for the next ConOps. The current one is available for download, and I welcome your comments. A little bit of the history. So, as you know, U-space started off as being a view of the future, and a series of political resolutions took place, and we identified that drones would be a source of growth. And U-space was described in 2017, and especially in the U-space blueprint, as being a collection of services. So it was on that basis that we began to think about U-space in these terms. There was a document in 2018 produced called the Roadmap for the Safe Integration in Drones into All Classes of Airspace, which again focused on a description of U-space as being a set of services. In 2017, the CORUS project had started, and the idea of the CORUS project was to write a concept of operations for U-space. So we took as the input this idea that it was a set of services, and we have kind of worked out from that basis. The situation in 2017, when we started, there were many, many projects ongoing. Nobody had heard of CORUS, and I felt there was a great deal of confusion about what people were talking about. Nobody had the same idea about anything. People were having a great deal of difficulty having discussions about problems because they were using different terminology. So the main aim for me for the ConOps had been to get everybody talking in the same terms in a way that they could understand each other, and that we would be able to promote some kind of dialogue without a great deal of wasted time and entropy. So CORUS started in 2017, and we began to construct a concept of operations by a kind of stakeholder outreach program. We wanted to collect together all the best ideas and put them together and construct a document which made sense. We were looking for simple explanations for things. We came up with this idea about describing the airspace in terms which a drone operator could understand. We didn't want to have to educate drone operators to the full extent of ICAO Annex 2 and Annex 11 and things like that. So we came up with this simple terminology, X, Y, Z. In X, I can fly. In Y, I need permission to fly. And in Z, there will be tactical services to help me fly. This simple model got a little bit more complicated. We started to get suffixes on some of these airspaces. ZA, if ATC was providing tactical services, ZU. But we managed to produce a description of how things worked, and that description can be downloaded in the Edition 3 ConOps, which I still see people downloading today. It's been downloaded more than 4,000 times since we published it in October 2019. That document is a bit big. We spent a lot of time trying to convince, trying to preach. There's a whole load of background stuff in there. It's not a handy reference. It's a bit of a tome. People have complained to me about why does it take so long to read. So one of the aims of CORUSXUAM was to produce a more concise document, a document which you could just look up and find the answer. You wouldn't find a great long explanation about why it is the way it is. It's just, it's like this. We also, between 2017's publication and now, we had seen the release by EASA of the U-space regulation, which introduced different terminology. So we were in a slightly uncomfortable situation that we had a ConOps in the research domain that wasn't the same as the terminology used in the regulation. So we realized we would have to pull these together. And at the same time, quite a lot of other stuff had come along. People had done more research work. They'd refined their ideas. It became clear that there was a need for an update. So we pitched this idea of a CORUSXUAM being a demonstration program with this little element of ConOps update in it. And I'm here to tell you what we've managed to achieve. In slightly over a year, we've made a revision to the ConOps in which we try to address the difficulties which I mentioned with the regulation and also the inputs coming from elsewhere. The ConOps coordination cell, which we held yesterday upstairs in this building, will feed the final version, which we will release next year. So some of the stuff which was mentioned isn't in there yet, but it's noted down and it'll come. So a little finishing the history. So the U-space regulation was published and the future came along and here we are now. The other thing that we had to add is urban air mobility. Urban air mobility became a term everybody was using. What is urban air mobility? We described it as something which is U-space but with higher risk. There will be passenger carrying vehicles present, and because of that, all of the operations have higher risk. And so we will need a more refined, a more certified, a more secure environment, but we also discovered that there will be one or two changes to the things that we described previously. And there will be some new processes which are needed related to arrival and departure at passenger vertiports in urban areas. Okay, so the other thing I should say, caveat, the ConOps of the SESAR project is a document looking into the future. You cannot hold this up and see the U-space regulation. The U-space regulation, I don't know if I'll elicit a response from Maria or the others. The U-space regulation that we have today is the initial U-space regulation. We will see evolution in both the acceptable means of compliance and the regulation as the traffic level rises. And we will see the integration into the regulation of our experience. Today, the regulation is written for an environment in which we have no confidence in CNS for drones. We will gain that confidence by flying, and that will influence how we regulate the situation. But today, the idea is we don't really know how well we know where the drones are, and because of that, we cannot assume that we can separate them tactically. In the ConOps, we've gone beyond that. We want tactical services. We know how they'll work. We expect the technology to catch up. So the ConOps is looking far into the future. And one of our aims had always been to avoid painting ourselves into a corner. We wanted a ConOps that would, from the beginning, look to the goal. We did not want a little evolutionary process that would end up in some dead end where we regretted some decision that we'd made. So from the beginning, we were looking to see how far we could go with the concept. And as mentioned, a few of the things which have been added in the most recent version, which is referred to as 3.1, we've added stuff about vertiports. There's a discussion about flight rules. It's not complete. I'm interested to hear your thoughts, but we identify the problem and a number of options. We've said some more about the airspace structure. We've refined our views and tried to align them a bit more with the regulation. We've aligned the services descriptions with the regulation, and we've taken on board some of the work from other projects that was already available at the time the ConOps was being written, which was some months ago, which include the work by Icarus, which we've tried to capture. So the ConOps is available. Please download it. If you have the time, please read it and send me your comments. And if you can send your comments by the end of the year, expect a new version sometime around April. So the 2019 services, you may have seen this picture. They included a lot of things which were in there to try and explain to the layman what is a U-space. And there's some stuff there which had very woolly descriptions that we thought these services would exist, but they're value-added services and they don't have really precise descriptions. So we removed them in the recent ConOps. Then we started to try and add services that we would need. We've separated conflict detection from conflict resolution because, as we have seen, these are being worked on separately. The ASTM F354821 standard is a standard for conflict detection. It doesn't tell you anything about conflict resolution. So we've separated these as different services, and we will have an opportunity to expand on these, both in the research domain and in future versions of the ConOps. We've added some stuff to do with vertiports, which I'll explain in a few minutes, so there's some services there. And we've tried to add the common altitude reference material coming from Icarus. I have a couple of pages here which tries to put the ConOps material in the context of the regulations. The U1 services that we call U-space services are not referred to as U-space services by regulation. They are features of this 2019-947 regulation. So they are obligations on states, they are obligations which, in our conceptual model, result in services being offered to the user, but they're not regulated services by EASA. So these include the collection together of airspace restriction information or airspace description information, which we term drone aeronautical information management. So in the drone world, there will be different authorities who are able to restrict or control where flights can take place. There's a good example that came from Benoit Kurdi. In Switzerland, in the spring, there is a restriction on flying near where birds are nesting. So the Ministry of Ecology will publish restrictions. The ANSP doesn't want to have anything to do with this. This is a Ministry of Ecology prerogative, which they will exercise. So the information will be synthesized into an overall picture in the drone aeronautical management function, and then is published to the users as geo-awareness. So we identify those as two separate activities. In later life, this becomes something like the CISP, but at the level of U1, we just call it Drone Aeronautical Information Management. There's also this requirement to have a registration process. We describe that as a registration service, but it's known in the regulation just as an obligation. And we also have this stuff about identifying drones. There's a requirement for a capability on the aircraft of some aircraft to broadcast some identification, and that is matched by a requirement for other aircraft to identify themselves through the network, which is the network identification process in 2019-947, which becomes a service in the U-space regulations. The U-space regulations, I've had to spread them over 3 pages. Article 5, Common Information Service, basically what I've just described, but it adds a new feature which is not currently in the ConOps, which is this U-space catalog. From the Common Information Service provider in the regulation, you can find out who can provide you services. So we don't offer that currently. We also have dynamic airspace reconfiguration, which pops up in Article 4 and in the 665 regulation. Article 8 clarifies and adds some detail on network identification, which is the basis as far as we are concerned in the general case for surveillance in U-space. And there is no tracking service in the U-space regulation, but there is an implication that there will be tracking. So I mention it here because later on we see it's a very strongly needed service. You cannot do tactical conflict resolution or detection without tracking. We also see there's an implication for a surveillance data exchange service. We see in the regulation discussion of a manned aircraft being made known to U-space, and there's a requirement clearly implied that at some occasions U-space will have to let the air traffic control know about errant drones. So there is a requirement for surveillance to be exchanged. And the geo-awareness service refines what has been said in the Common Information Service about geo-awareness. Similarly linked, we have Article 10, the Flight Authorization Service, which implies a number of what were previously separate services. We have what I mention here as the Operation Plan Processing Service, which is a kind of full life cycle of the flight service. This has been redefined by the GOF2 project as a drone flight service, which is a separate service from flight authorization. And I really like this idea, and I'll put that in the final ConOps, that we have this separate service which is managing the current state of the flight, which is not about a plan processing, but it was about an active flight service. The main focus, as far as I'm concerned, of Article 10 is strategic conflict, prevention. And so we put the strategic stuff under there. And in discussion with Stefan, he's interested that we have some element of dynamic capacity management in Article 10 that we would like to limit, that areas become saturated. So that is another one of our existing services which has a home here. Article 11, traffic information, again relies on surveillance, and we see the role for tracking here. And Article 11 in the regulation covers a number of things which we described in the ConOps as emergency management. Alerting when a drone is far off course, alerting other people, drawing their attention to the fact that there's danger. Weather information service, fairly succinct. And Article 13, conformance monitoring, again maps onto a couple of services in our model. The monitoring service, which is more general, and the emergency management service. And then reading between the lines in the regulation, you find a few other things are in there. There is clearly a need for an accident and incident reporting service, which is one of our services, and that will depend on some kind of recording being in existence. And we have seen that there will be other users of these recordings. I'm not sure if this will ever be implemented, but there is certainly some people thinking about this digital logbook idea that you could find out how many flight hours you have had and things like that. In our work, we've defined the procedural interface with ATC. We haven't defined it terribly clearly. Aura have done a great deal of work to revise that, and a lot of the things that were presented yesterday and the previous ConOps coordination cell with Aura will find their way into the final ConOps. So we now have a much better idea about what a procedural interface with ATC looks like. The ConOps talks about these geographical databases which help the planning process. These have been expanded in projects like Icarus, so they will remain. They are outside what is in the regulation today. And then we have talked about the requirement to monitor services to show that they are still functioning, to warn the operator if they fail, basically. The Icarus project took the communication infrastructure monitoring service and extended it to include an augmentation function, which is quite nice. They are not only monitoring that the service is functioning, they are monitoring the error which it has. So a few words about the kind of things which we've been adding to the ConOps. I just remind you a bit about passenger carrying operations. You probably know all this. We have 2 eVTOLs in front of us. So the vertiport becomes a key resource, and the vertiport becomes a key resource because of the need of aircraft to be able to divert. We have, with our CORUSXUAM participant volocopter, we have talked a great deal about the requirements coming for a plan for a flight which continuously has a diversion point on the way. And the diversion points for these flights will include nearby vertiports. So although the flight may not start or end there, it will still be interested in a nearby vertiport as somewhere it might go in case of a problem. And so because of that, every vertiport eventually becomes an alternative landing site for every passing vehicle. So whether it is available or not becomes safety critical information for all of the other traffic. So we have added a service about vertiport availability and short-term planning, which is there for this safety, to support this safety requirement. We've been looking into flight rules. We talked about this for many tens of hours. And I'm a bit disappointed we haven't concluded, but perhaps not surprised. But we have a requirement for a flight rule. Today, drones cannot fly either IFR, well, small ones, or VFR. And legally, we can't put them into existing ICAO airspaces unless either they fly one of those two flight rules or we go to ICAO and we redefine the airspaces, which frankly will be long after I'm dead if we manage to achieve that. But, so there's some interest in trying to get a flight rule for UAS which is resembling an existing one. And the two that we were looking at, obviously, was some kind of, could we make a VFR-like experience for a drone pilot, or a drone piloting software, so that they could provide separation themselves based on information they're receiving from U-space. So we talk about this as being a kind of special VFR-like. And this is an interesting approach to go down because this might be a flight rule that could also be followed by manned aviation. We could, with a flight rule like this, provide a pilot with an augmentation screen, perhaps something a bit like FLARM, but better, that would help direct their gaze in the case of conflicts, that would be the sole basis for situational awareness for the remote pilot. I'd like to see a research project on this, really. This isn't really something that we can do in an annex to our project. The other approach would be to try and bend IFR. The reason small UAS can't fly IFR is mostly to do with equipage, not to do with the ability of the aircraft to follow the instructions. So that might be an easier one to attack. If we could somehow modify the equipage requirements so that these aircraft could be classed as flying IFR, then we could go to all-weather operations, and I think this would be something that the air taxi industry would be very interested in. So we're working on that. I welcome your comments. I don't think we'll conclude it, but it's something which is mentioned in the ConOps. And finally, in the remaining minute before you get your lunch, what we have attempted to show, what these 6 demonstrations you've heard about have attempted to show is, can U-space support urban air mobility? And our conclusion is yes, it can. We can use the same concept of operations to support passenger carrying operations and small UAS flying in risky situations. We would like to get to the stage where we can converge U-space with ATM. And to do that, we need to tackle these remaining problems about flight rules in order to not only fly in segregated airspaces. So as I said, the ConOps is available. If you go to our webpage, you have to look for new U-space ConOps. Please download it, please read it, please put a red line all over it, and then send me your comments, because I have to start writing it in January. Thank you very much.